Okay, you're live.
Great.
There you go.
Hello, guys. We are live from the Sayreville Public Library. We're going to do an episode of Guide to the Unknown. A
Yeah.
little double trouble this week.
Kind of a surprise. We didn't really talk about live streaming this ahead of time, but we figured why not? We're here.
Yeah,
We may as well.
exactly.
So we're gonna get started in just a few minutes.
Yeah.
Guide to the Unknown. The way that it works, like I said, it's kind of a chat show, comedy show kind of thing. So there's always something of an introduction to let people know that the show is beginning, and then when the show is over, we have a sign off.
Yeah.
And then we'll probably still end up signing off and just sitting right here like nothing has really changed for us, but in the
Right.
show world, I'll edit and change everything around.
Yeah.
Okay, what do you think? Do you want to just go for it?
I think we probably should,
We
right?
may as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. If people show up, they show up. If people
Yeah.
don't show up, they don't show up. So I think we'll just get
We're here.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. We're here. As you
Okay.
should.
All right.
All right, and you're on good time, Chrissy.
All right.
Oh, you know what? Give me 5
Seconds
seconds of
of
silence just for the edit. Okay, we're in good shape.
Okay.
All right.
All right, so I'm going to talk unnaturally now. A little on-air voice.
Show mode.
Yep.
All right.
Hello, welcome to Guide to the Unknown. I'm Kristen.
I'm William.
And you may see we're in a different location today because we're recording live from the Sayreville Public Library, where one of our listeners, Jennifer, works and asked us to come do a show here. So thank you very much, Jennifer.
Yeah, it's very cool. This is the first time that we've ever done a live show out in the wild. We've never really left the basement very
No.
much unless we're,
In general.
traveling somewhere or sitting in a car talking about something.
Right?
Yeah, so we brought out all our gear. We've got a few visual aids of something that we're going to talk about tonight.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's going to be fun. So, maybe for the people out there in Radio Land, make some noise. Let them know you're here.
Whoa, 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 whoa.
That's just to prove that there are other people.
Yes.
Imagine a cathedral full, hundreds of people. That's what's on the other side of the camera from us.
They are freaking out. It's a little bit quieter than you might think, because some people are on the ground rolling around in the throes of ecstasy.
They can't believe it. It's like the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. People are freaking out. They try to break down the door to get in.
They had it. And I'm Ringo.
Yeah. It's 2 Ringos.
Yep.
Yeah.
So tonight we are going to talk about grimoires, spell books that have a lot of history and lore and have some pop culture significance that you may have heard of before.
Yeah. So I don't know literally what grimoires specifically are, but I think probably the most famous example of a grimoire is something you may have heard of called the Necronomicon.
Right.
Are you familiar with this?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? One? Okay. So the Necronomicon is a book of spells. It has references to different kind of monsters, entries, and you can think of it something like an encyclopedia about demons. And one of the most famous instances of the Necronomicon popping up in pop culture is in a movie series called Evil Dead.
Right.
Evil Dead is, you can think of it kind of like a character fighting zombies, something like that, but they're all born out of the Necronomicon. Somebody picks up this book, which is bound in human flesh. It is written in blood. And when they read an incantation, it brings the dead out attacking.
That's right. But not all grimoires are necessarily that hardcore. Some are. It's kind of up to the author. It can be whatever you want it to be, basically. It's basically a catch-all term for a magical textbook. So they can contain spells and instructions for putting together rituals, putting together magical objects like creating jewelry out of things that have significance, divination, invoking spirits or demons like in the Necronomicon. Basically anything of magical significance to the person who writes it or puts it together. So they can be for good or evil, basically as long as they deal with like the occult and the unknown and mystical things, that can count as a grimoire. And I thought it was interesting, it's called a grimoire. The etymology is from a French word that I will not pronounce correctly. It's an old French word, grammaire, which was originally used to refer to books that were in Latin. And because a lot of old magical texts were in Latin, those things ended up getting mushed together over time, so that in the 1700s, eventually the word grimoire just came to mean like a magical text. So depending on the book, either some people believe that the books themselves have magical properties physically, like the books can protect themselves or repel things, or what's in the book can be sort of enlivened and given magical power by the person doing whatever they're going to do with it. And now, to throw to on the evil side, the
Yeah.
Necronomicon.
Definitely evil. The Necronomicon in particular is supposed to be like a tome of great evil, great ill will. It holds a lot of spirits. In the Evil Dead series, it said that it cannot be destroyed. They try to burn it, they try to cut it, whatever. You cannot destroy this book. And then I went ahead and Googled, can I get my own Necronomicon? And for $7.99 at Barnes & Noble, I was able to get this deadly, dangerous copy of the Simon Necronomicon. Who is Simon? I don't know.
Did you get that recently?
Yeah, I got this today.
Wow.
I picked this up today from
Were there
Barnes
a
&
bunch
Noble.
of copies of the Necronomicon there?
I don't know. I made an
Okay.
odd choice, I must admit.
Okay, did you like pre-order or something?
I didn't pre-order it. I did go online to try to find a Necronomicon because it occurred to me, while we're doing the show, I can look up stuff about the Necronomicon that I can tell you about. But hey, wouldn't it also be great if there was a Necronomicon that I could buy?
Right.
And so I looked online. I saw that Barnes & Noble had it for $8.
Yeah.
Figured, why not?
Steal at any price.
So I placed an online order that I had to go pick up.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, so-
you didn't go browse the shelves.
I did not browse the shelves, but it did occur to me at a certain point that like I'm a horror writer, and I wear all black all the time, and then I went midday to Barnes & Noble alone to pick up my copy of the Necronomicon.
They probably thought you were a dark warlock.
They were right. I am a dark warlock. But it was kind of embarrassing. I was a little embarrassed. And then I immediately went over and sat in a little cafe and feverishly read my new copy of the Necronomicon.
That's less dark. So I think that you may have negated some of like the dark air. I was looking pre-ordering it from Barnes and Noble might undercut the evilness of the whole thing. Like if
Oh,
you
I
have to
couldn't agree
buy a
more.
paperback Necronomicon, so they might not have thought you were as scary and crazy looking as what
Yeah.
you're painting it.
Oh, 1,000%. I couldn't agree more. I think that the fact that this is something that you can buy from Amazon or from
Yeah.
Barnes & Noble really explains that this is not true or
Yeah,
to
it's
be
not to be
feared.
taken super seriously.
Not at all. But I will say where it comes from. The Necronomicon was first mentioned by the horror writer H.P. Lovecraft. And it first appeared in a book called the 1927, The Hound, 1924. It appeared in his first, it first appeared in the 1924 story, The Hound, where it is said to be bound in human skin. That's a story about grave robbers. I actually talked about that on a previous episode of the show. And the term Necronomicon comes from three things. Necros, meaning dead, Nomos, meaning law, and icon, meaning image. So it's an image of the laws of the dead. It is a book that's supposed to explain the rules of the afterlife and demons and so on. H.P. Lovecraft also wrote a book called The History of the Necronomicon. He wrote that in 1927, but it wasn't published until after his death. It was not the Necronomicon itself. He wrote a book about the fictional history of the Necronomicon, the ways that it has hands, the ways that it pops up in history over the course of hundreds of years. It was said to originally have been written by Abdul al-Hazred in Sumeria, who was half crazed and was essentially writing down in this book his own personal experiences of coming across arcane artifacts that explained the world of the dead and gods and Babylonian figures, and the Necronomicon is his personalized account, his individual experiences. And H.P. Lovecraft says that this book at one point also popped up in Salem, which obviously implies that it was part of the Salem witch trials. So it was, at the same time, I should also say, H.P. Lovecraft never professed that this was a real book.
Okay.
He was always very upfront about the fact that this was something that he made up. He had completely invented this for a horror story. He was a horror writer. Nevertheless, a lot of people took it really seriously.
Just because it was so cool, they were like, I want this to be real, so let's buy into it.
Yes, a lot of people would start incorporating the Necronomicon into things that they themselves had written, which I quite frankly think is where even the movie series Evil Dead kind of plays into a nearly 100-year-long tradition of pretending that this book exists.
Right.
Why don't we just write this into our movie? A lot of horror movies have done the same thing. Use the Necronomicon, even though it has never actually been a tangible thing you can hold on to.
But now it's so woven into like horror lore that it's almost real in that way. It's something that you can reference, and a lot of people have a reference point for it.
Yes.
If nothing else, they know it's a scary book.
1,000%. And that's why in 1977, an anonymous guy calling himself Simon wrote this version of the Necronomicon that I'm currently holding in my hands, saying that it is part of that lineage. This is essentially being professed to be the Necronomicon that H.P. Lovecraft originally wrote about.
Was H.P. Lovecraft around when he wrote this, do you know? Like, I wonder
When
what-
this was written?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
No, he would have been dead for about nearly 40 years.
Okay, very good.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's a hard no.
Yeah, no, he was toast. So I read the Necronomicon,
Okay. Cover to cover?
and I lived to tell the tale. No, honestly, if I was going to give a true book review of the
A
Necronomicon,
little dry.
skip it, it's a
Yeah.
snoozer.
Yeah.
Listen to this show instead. You're going to get everything you need to know.
It'll be the close notes.
I'm about to read from the Necronomicon. If a demon appears, I should also say we're not responsible for what it might do.
No, also spoiler alerts for the Necronomicon.
Exactly. Spoiler alert for the Necronomicon. So this book is like, I don't know, almost 400 pages long. The first 80 pages are a series of forwards by Simon, by the editor. It's just all context. It's about 80 pages of pure setup. They
It's a
constantly,
navel-gazing book.
1,000%. They constantly mention H.P. Lovecraft, the old gods, which H.P. Lovecraft wrote about, these sort of intangible evil things that are older than the world, the old gods like Cthulhu, and Marduk, and hey,
Marmaduke? Does he come up?
there are a series of great Marmadukes halfway through this book.
You should really read them.
He won't get off the couch. Pazuzu
Ah,
is referenced in the book.
okay.
There are actually like a few like movie references in the book that I find both interesting and kind of odd.
Yeah, that's weird.
It's very weird.
When did you say this was written again?
1977.
Okay, so The Exorcist was out by then, right?
The Exorcist is referenced
Yeah.
in this.
Oh, okay.
Uh-huh.
Interesting.
I straight up think that this is born out of not only a lot of appreciation for sort of the odd fourth wall breaking horror that H.P. Lovecraft was doing.
Mhm.
I also think that in the 70s there was a cultural fascination with demonic entities.
Yeah.
Because if you look at The Omen, if you look at The Exorcist, there was obviously something in the zeitgeist, there was a through line in a lot of media that you can become possessed,
Right.
that demons can't take over you. And I kind of think that this book is riding on that wave. At a certain point when they're mentioning gods like Cthulhu, they also mention, I just liked this, they mention Azathoth,
Okay.
the blind idiot god. Of the gods, you don't want to be called the blind idiot.
I also think you don't want to be calling a god a blind idiot.
You would
Whoever
think.
names the god that I feel like is in big trouble.
I don't know, I just don't know.
Careful.
But are we supposed to fear the blind idiot? It's one thing to be called blind, if you're blind, you're blind.
Yeah, right.
But an idiot,
Absolutely, that's the real problem
yeah,
there.
the idiot god.
Yeah,
I'm gonna read to you an excerpt
okay.
from the beginning here, which sort of gets into the idea of not just the Necronomicon, but grimoires. What
Okay.
are books like this? These were the sorcerer's handbooks, and generally not meant as textbooks or encyclopedias of ceremonial magic with a K.
Of course.
In other words, the sorcerer or magician is supposed to be in possession of the requisite knowledge and training with which to carry out a complex magical ritual, just as a cook is expected to be able to master the scrambling of eggs before he conjures an eggs benedict.
Conjures and eggs benedict.
You ever go to a restaurant and they conjure some eggs benedict for you?
So we're just inserting magical language wherever we can. Even as it
Absolutely.
pertains to making eggs benedict.
I love the mundane.
Sky's all in.
Yeah, I love the mundane
I'll
reality.
say that.
You can see what he's going for, though.
Yes.
These books are not supposed to be an instructional guide on how to do stuff. They assume that you might have some knowledge of your own already. You got to bring that
Right.
to the table. But I just love that they talk about conjuring
Conjuring
eggs
eggs
benedict.
benedict.
Also, the people who write the Necronomicon are totally the kinds of people who use words like conjure.
Yeah. Well, especially, I mean, if you're using it in reference to food,
Yeah.
then you know that's sprinkled liberally throughout their vocabulary.
Yes.
Because that's like the least of the things you would conjure.
Absolutely. Much like I liberally sprinkle cheese on many a meal.
Sprinkling, yeah.
Anyway. They also say that the original manuscript was produced by a priest who was ordained by uncanonical methods.
Oh.
They really want to paint a picture that this was
Yeah.
sort of an unusual book that was crafted over the course of a
It's off
long
the grid.
time. Yeah, it's off the grid. It's made by strange, odd people. They couldn't tell what they were looking at. The book was originally written in Greek. They couldn't overlook that the title was the Necronomicon, much like they couldn't ignore what they say are a bunch of weird drawings inside. And truthfully, the Necronomicon has a bunch of symbols inside their entire, there'll be dozens of pages in a row where they just are listing out different, forms that a god took and the symbol associated with that form, things like that.
Are they referring to them as weird drawings?
Yes, they say that they are weird drawings.
It's so strange to be so formal that you call making eggs Benedict conjuring.
Exactly.
And then take a look at symbols that symbolize gods and call those weird drawings.
Yes.
There
Yeah.
seems to be a disconnect
I
with
can-
old Simon.
I completely agree with you. I think it's really kind of interesting, and it sort of almost speaks to like this matter-of-fact reality that produced this particular edition of this book.
Right.
The Necronomicon contains references to weird drawings and eggs Benedict, and it's considered to be the most evil.
That's
You
what I'm
know,
saying.
like-
This doesn't seem like a really serious book.
No, some of it is, some of it isn't. We'll kind of get into a little bit. So they couldn't be sure what they'd been handed. But then as they started to try to translate the book, they started realizing the kinds of trouble they were in. A great deal of misfortune accompanied the publication of this book. First, we went through more than one translator.
Okay.
I know, I want to know the context. Did the people
Yeah.
die of fright? Did they just go like,
Does that? Yeah.
this stinks, I
I was
quit?
gonna say, that's vague enough that it sounds like translators could have just quit.
Yeah.
We went through.
I
It
want
didn't
out.
say like
Right.
multiple translators have perished while working on this project.
Yep.
That's creative.
The last finally absconded with his preface, describing his work in such detail, in some detail. This we will have to do from memory in the following pages. At one point, an unscrupulous publisher from the West Coast took a copy of the initial preface and some of the miscellaneous pages in translation, including some dummies, which we were in the habit of giving potential publishers for our protection.
Oh boy.
Sort of annoying to work with.
Yes, definitely. And then does that mean that this 80-page forward was actually going to be like 90?
Maybe, I don't know. Yeah,
Yes.
steal more pages.
Yeah.
We need more unscrupulous publishers to take more pages of this intro. At a crucial stage in the preparation of the manuscript, the editor was stricken with a collapsed lung and had to undergo emergency surgery to save his life.
Okay.
So, we covered other stuff on the show where people go into haunted houses and
Mhm.
things like that and end up finding themselves in the hospital. They also at one point explained that somebody was attacked by their own dog while they were working on this book. Just the point is,
Yeah. Some terror has befallen those who worked on this book.
Absolutely. So the book is obsessed with Sumerian history and Sumerian folklore. Sumeria is basically modern day Iraq. And the only thing I could think about was Ghostbusters.
Yeah, there's a lot of Sumerian talk.
A lot of Sumerian talk. Egon and Ray are constantly talking about ancient Babylonian demons and Sumerian gods and stuff like that. That was kind of exciting.
Yeah.
Honestly, I ended up looking up a lot of Ghostbusters stuff because of reading this book, and it just means I'm going to watch a bunch of Ghostbusters movies.
Yeah.
If one good thing comes out of reading the Necronomicon, it's that I will get
Watching Ghostbusters.
yet another excuse to watch
I was gonna say,
Ghostbusters.
like, you needed one.
I'm always like,
Yeah.
yeah. They talk about how Marduk, Destroyer of Chaos, defeated Tiamat the same way a famous movie ends.
Okay.
It was in much the same fashion that the chief of police from Amity Island slays the great white shark in Jaws by blowing an evil wind, which was an oxygen tank in the movie,
Yeah.
into her mouth and sending an arrow after it to explode her.
Okay. Why are they drawing that parallel?
Because surely the 2 or 3 most box office successful films in the past few years, Jaws, The Exorcist, and perhaps The Godfather, are an indication that the essence of Sumerian mythology is making itself felt in a very real way in this, the latter half of the 20th century. They're saying that even culture of the time, which is still, I think, modern pop culture,
Right.
is a descendant of Sumerian mythology, of Marduk defeating Tiamat. Jaws is just the latest incarnation of the
Strange.
classic Marduk Tiamat
Right. Exactly.
story. It's just the latest iteration of Marduk.
Yeah.
Um,
Seems like a little bit of a stretch.
oh, it's a definite stretch,
Yeah.
1,000%.
Yeah.
And then I think the final thing I'm going to deliberately, literally read from the book, and talk about some of the other stuff. This is what I had really been waiting for. I had to get through a bunch of the book to get to the one thing I actually wanted,
Okay.
which was a disclaimer about the danger of the book. That is what I wanted out of the Necronomicon. All right. In the interim period between the translation and the publication of this work, the editor, along with a circle of initiates in another discipline, undertook an experiment with the rituals and forces outlined in the Necronomicon. In using the material alone, or within a Western ceremonial structure, we came upon startling discoveries in both cases. There are no effective banishings for the forces invoked in the Necronomicon itself. They warn you, do not
Yeah,
summon demons from the Necronomicon because you cannot make them
there's
go
no
away.
one doing it.
You're stuck with them.
Yeah,
They're going to be your new roommate.
it's a serious undertaking.
It is. So the essential structure of the Necronomicon is as follows. This is a text that was compiled by Abdul al-Azrahid, who essentially came across all these texts, had a horrific experience with it, and tried to document what happened to him so it would not happen to other people. Do not follow the stuff that he put in the book. He's just sort of documenting it out.
So why be so specific about it? You know, I guess you could say that it's being specific so you don't accidentally stumble on doing these things
Right.
and have the same fate.
Right.
But you can also say that being so specific would lead people to do that if they were so inclined. You could be giving a little bit of a guidebook to a bad guy.
That's true. Is that perhaps the influence of the demons themselves?
Hard to say.
My God.
Oh my God.
My God. So the book, the true Necronomicon, opens with an account from Abdul, where he's explaining what happened to him, how he found this, a series of symbols. Here's what the symbols mean, and now I'm going to explain to you all the rest of the books of the Necronomicon.
Okay.
Starts with the Zonai, which is about astrology.
Mm-hmm.
I did not get very far into that.
Okay.
Then they get into the Book of Entrance, which explains how those celestial bodies can be arranged to form gates. Then comes the incantation of the gates, which is about how you interact with those gates. You might travel through them or get stuff to come out of them.
Okay.
There's the conjuration of the fire god, literally a one-page speech where you try to get the fire god to appear. Who is the fire god?
We don't find out?
I have no idea who that
Very
is.
good. Very good.
There's the conjuration of the watcher. Watchers are basically angels, but said to be mindless. They're also very good at what they do. They watch.
Okay, so it's their singular focus.
They don't even care what they watch.
Okay.
They just
Are they
watch.
affecting what they watch?
I don't know.
Like, why do you want to conjure them if they're mindless and they're just going to watch you?
Kristen, you may never know.
Oh, there were some what?
If only there was a way. There's the book of Maklu, which includes the infamous Zilka Besa text. Try Googling that.
Yeah.
It gives you nothing. There are tons of things about exorcisms, though. On page 86, there's the exorcism against the possessing spirit, which says, the demon that seizeth man, the Gigum, who warreth evil, the spawn of the wicked spirit. Spirit of the sky, remember. Spirit of the earth, remember. You'll get rid of a demon
Oh, okay.
that's possessing you. So just play that back.
Yeah.
Find yourself possessed. There's
So there
also,
are some undoers in here.
yeah, I guess that's
Wall to
true.
wall scary.
Yeah, but they claim that this won't banish stuff.
Right. Yes.
Kristen, do you think
just
there's-
gotta take it as it comes.
Do you think there's any chance that they were just trying to be spooky?
No, there's absolutely no way.
There's no way, right?
This is all of substance.
On page 91, a most excellent charm against the hordes of demons that assail in the night.
Right on.
It only makes me think
Excellent.
of Bill and Ted, you know? A most excellent charm against the hordes of demons. There's the Book of Calling with a love spell
Okay.
in it. The Book of 50 Names, they're the 50 names of Marduk. Because he was given 50 powers to defeat Tiamat, you see, Kristen. My favorite, of course, was the 13th name, Tutu.
Huh.
Silences the weeping and gives joy to the sad and ill at heart.
That's nice.
Tutu.
I mean, just the name Tutu is a little, like, perky,
Yeah.
so
How's it going,
I
Tutu?
already feel a little joyful.
I feel joyful
Yeah,
now.
my heart's turning a corner.
Yeah. Megan, which is sort of a Sumerian creation epic. It sort of explains where the world came from. At one point it says, Tiamat, enraged, filled with evil motion, said, let us make monsters that may go out and do battle. Which I love that there is some
Yeah.
translation, let us make monsters is such a simplistic,
Yes.
if somebody just told you to make a monster,
Right, it's not very flowery, it's
Right.
to the point, but if you think about what it is, that's horrifying.
yes. Then it closes again with another, the other half of the Abdul al-Hazred text where he explains his personal experience with it. But in this second half, now that he's documented everything, you sort of get the sense that his mind is unraveling. He's somewhat repeating what he said in his forward, either to maybe punctuate a point or because he forgot that he said it. So it's really sort of painting a picture of somebody who has been destroyed to some extent by what he was documenting. And the way that it ends is kind of that it doesn't end. The Abdul al-Hazred texts don't really culminate with any sort of grand thought, any wonderful sign-off. I mean, to a certain extent, it depends on how you interpret things. The stars grow dim in their places and the moon pales before me, as though a veil were blown across its flame. Dog-faced demons approach the circumference of my sanctuary. Strange lines appear carved on my door and walls, and the light from the window grows increasing dim. A wind has risen. The dark waters stir. This is the book of the servants of the gods. That's the end. And it doesn't really, you don't find out really who he was, what happened to him. The sort of implication is that he was working on it until he wasn't.
So I didn't realize there was kind of a narrative going
Neither did I.
along here. So it doesn't feel like there is in any way until that last chapter? Because I guess I think
The
it was
forward and the
intro.
epilogue
Yeah.
from Abdul al-Hazred, which is kind of interesting, and it is sort of, I brought a few books here to the show that you and I have talked about in the past that are tied into pop culture. Twin Peaks is a television series that you and I both enjoyed, made by David Lynch. And in the past few years, they compiled these dossiers, which purport to be in-universe explanations of things that happen to the characters in a town called Twin Peaks. And it's newspaper articles about what happened to these fictional characters, things like that. We've also got these Blair Witch books from the Blair Witch franchise. Similar thing. There's a documentarian who's accumulated all of these bits of material about characters, and they're pretending that these worlds are real.
Right.
And weirdly enough, I feel like they're following the format of the Necronomicon. The Necronomicon is oddly a kind of like found footage book,
Yeah.
if you think about it as something that was compiled and
Right, by a person to have everything in one spot that you shouldn't do.
Right.
They're
Yeah.
doing this to give you like a map away from what should be happening, basically. So
Exactly.
there is, a documentarian who's in there. That's interesting.
And what I read to you before about the idea of a grimoire being somebody's personal experiences with things. The Necronomicon is not the worst book in the world. It's what Abdul al-Hazred, a fictional character, granted, is supposedly has experienced. And this is his personal document. It just got super duper famous because of H.P. Lovecraft and horror movies and stuff like that.
Right.
But I honestly think that if you compile your own personal experiences with something horrific in a tome, is that just a grimoire?
I guess it depends on if it's kind of magical in nature, because that seems to be like the defining characteristic of a grimoire is that it's mystical in some way. So somebody's just regular diary of their trek across Europe, Eat, Pray, Love is not a grimoire. You know what I mean?
That's a great point.
But maybe if she encountered a bunch of witches and stuff, and she had written down ways to engage with them or avoid them, depending on what kind of witch it was,
Right.
then maybe you could say it was a grimoire.
Interesting.
That seems to be the key ingredient. There has to be something that's not of this world that you're interacting with.
That makes sense.
Mhm.
To a certain extent, Guide to the Unknown, there was a version of the world where we considered this as something that could be a book.
That's right.
Is Guide to the Unknown as a podcast where we experience paranormal phenomenon week in, week out,
But
where we
it's
talk
more
about it.
how you interact with it. I don't know
We're,
if it's just
we're
straight up.
technically, you and I are like vessels for spreading these messages.
We are, but I think that the grimoire thing is more, it has to be somewhat instructional in nature. I don't think it's just straight up documenting. So in that sense, I don't know, they're grimoire adjacent because they might have to do with things that are not of this world, like the books we just talked about that document things. But I think there's something a little bit instructional about them that's also important.
One of the
It's
Twin
not-
Peaks books tells you how to make a cherry pie.
Okay, so there you go. Yeah. Supernaturally good cherry pie, that's all I need to know.
Yeah, well, there you go. That's
Yeah.
my dissection, and finally getting close contact with the Necronomicon.
Yeah.
$7.99 Barnes & Noble. Don't bother.
you shouldn't bother because it's danger in here. This book is telling you not to read it.
Supposedly, we'll see what happens to me, I guess.
Yeah, jury's still out, I suppose. So another famous grimoire, I think that when you think of the word grimoire, if you do, you probably don't think about it all that
Comes
much.
to me every morning. Grimoire. Sorry, wake up every morning.
It's kind of interchangeable with the term Book of Shadows. These are both things that people make today. Like if you go on Pinterest and you look up grimoire or look up Book of Shadows, you'll see people making their own things. They're not necessarily always sinister. Because again, the main thing is that it's something that is mystical, it's a little otherworldly, and something that you want to document for yourself. So some people are all about that kind of thing.
I guess people just like being spooky in general.
People like these again, it's, you know, a lot of it can be a lot of like kind of modern eclectic witchcraft from like reading and things like that is mostly about your intention. Like there are religions and organized things within witchcraft, like Wicca or paganism or whatever, but there are a lot of people who are just sort of, you know, vaguely, well, not vaguely, spiritual but not boxing themselves in. So those people might make a Book of Shadows or a grimoire to remind themselves of the phases of the moon or herbs that are good for this or that or whatever. And so I guess the reason that's in my awareness is that people call them either grimoires or books of shadows when they post them online. And so I decided to look up what the deal is with a Book of Shadows and where that originally came from. And it actually is, it's kind of almost like a brand name of a grimoire. So if grimoires are tissues, a Book of Shadows traditionally is Kleenex.
Okay.
Like a Book of Shadows traditionally is a Wiccan grimoire.
Oh, okay.
And there's kind of a crazy story I wasn't expecting. It's a little bit like soap opera-y behind this, so I really stepped in it. So the first Book of Shadows that was called that we really know about was from this guy named Gerald Garner, who is known as the father, oh yeah, that's right, it's also the name of a character in the children's movie Heavyweights from the 90s.
It's the name of a fat kid from a comedy movie.
Yes,
All
yes.
right.
About a kid who goes
Gerald
through that.
Garner.
Yeah.
Ben Stiller gives him a hard time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gerald Garner gets a little bit of a hard time in 1950s Wicca.
Oh,
Although
yeah?
it seems like he kind of had it coming to him.
All
So. Gerald Garner.
Sorry, that ran through me.
Perhaps he's the grandson of Wicca,
Maybe.
as Gerald Garner in the 50s was the father of Wicca. So he introduced something to his coven, which was called the Bricket Wood Coven in England in 1952 that he called his Book of Shadows. And he said it was interesting that you used an analogy of a cookbook before, because he said the same thing. He told him this is like a cookbook of spells. And you can look at it, it's been passed down to him through generations. He says he's just revealing this now, but he's had this for a while. And he told them that they could look at it, copy things down into their own books of spells, but then add or subtract things as they want to make it personalized for them. Let me see. Okay, so, but as I said, there was kind of a little bit of scandal around it a little while after he presented it. So he presented it in 1952. And he also started to correspond by letter with a young witch named Doreen Valiente, the best young witch name I can think
Yeah,
of.
Doreen Valiente.
Doreen Valiente was corresponding with Gerald Garner because he was like a big wig in the Wiccan circle
Lucky
in
luck.
England during that time. Yeah. And she eventually came and joined the coven in 1953, so the year after he presented the Book of Shadows to the coven. She eventually wrote in her book called The Rebirth of Witchcraft in 2018, that she kind of caught Gerald Garner plagiarizing from some other things in the Book of Shadows. He said that everything that he found from it was from ancient practices and people passing things down to him, but it seems like he may have been banking on the idea that people in his coven maybe weren't as well read as he was, but Doreen Valiente was. So she looked at this and realized that he was pulling a lot from Aleister Crowley.
Sure.
Or Crowley, is it?
I think it's Crowley.
It's Crowley.
Crowley.
Yeah, Crowley. He was pulling a lot from Aleister Crowley and some other books that Crowley pulled from. So some things made sense. Like if there was a really old magical practice that actually is ancient, it would make sense that Crowley pulled from it and maybe this guy pulled from it too. But there were some phrases that were like directly lifted from Crowley.
Oh, wow.
That she was like, I see what you're doing here, and I'm
You're
not.
trying to be Crowley 2.0.
Exactly, and it wasn't working. Oh, no, I mean, I guess it was kind of working. He was very popular. So in terms of popularity, maybe he was like a little bit of Crowley 2.0, maybe the softer side of Crowley. Because part of the reason she didn't like that stuff in the Book of Shadows is that she likes the idea of the Book of Shadows, but she didn't like Crowley's reputation. And she didn't want that kind of staining what they were doing in Wicca. Because while Crowley engaged in like occult stuff and witchcraft, he didn't identify as Wiccan, I believe.
Okay.
She also said in her book that it seems like he pulled the name Book of Shadows from a magazine, and that the name wasn't something that was passed down to him either.
Just from a magazine?
Yes. So she points to the fact that he wrote a book about magic called High Magic's Aid in 1949. It was supposed to be about medieval magic and kind of old magic. And you would think, if this is the case, if this guy has known about this stuff, there are kind of two arguments you can make. She was saying, if this guy knew about the Book of Shadows that is so integral to Wicca, why didn't he write about it in this book that he wrote 3 years before he presented the Book of Shadows to his coven? You could say, well, maybe he wanted to keep it secret and then he decided to present it to his
Hold
coven.
all the material and then release something that's more specifically focused on it.
Or maybe he didn't want to share that with like the larger world in a public book and wanted to keep it a little bit more
Right.
private within his coven, but she doesn't really feel that way. And she thinks that he found the term Book of Shadows, which this is very funny to me. She said there was a magazine in 1949 that was called The Occult Observer, and he had placed an ad in that magazine for his book, High Magic's Aid, and coincidentally or not, there was an article right across from the ad called The Book of Shadows. That was written by a palmist, like somebody who's into palmistry and palmistry, named Mir Bashir, and it was about a supposedly ancient Sanskrit method of divination by reading the length of people's shadows.
Oh.
So it wasn't about a grimoire called the Book of Shadows, but she said she feels like he saw the name, was like, oh, that's a pretty good name. And maybe things sprung from there, and that just wasn't his original idea.
Weird.
So when she joined the coven, because she's like very well read, Doreen Valiente is all over it, she's really applying herself, she ended up rising to the position of high priestess within the coven.
Is that hard to do?
I don't know, I'm not sure, I don't know, it sounds big.
Congratulations. But it occurred to me, I was about to be like, whoa, and then I was like, but maybe there are 2 people in the coven. I don't know how this
I
works.
don't think so, I think, because he was a big deal, so I don't think it was a teeny coven.
Yeah.
And also there was a split later where people from the coven left with Valiente, which suggests to me that there are enough people to split off.
Okay.
So I think this is like a decently sizable coven. Don't have the numbers
Mid-tier.
in front of me. Mid-tier.
Mid-tier coven.
So she's rising up in the ranks. She's trying to be a muckety muck. And she tells him, like, I see what you've done here. There's a lot of Crowley stuff in here and I'm not about it. And he got defensive. And he said, there was a Book of Shadows passed down to me, but a lot of the info in it was kind of fragmented, so I had to sort of fill in the gaps myself so it was readable. And he said, if you think you could do a better job at this, then why don't you go ahead and do that? And so she did.
Oh, wow.
She was like, all right, I'm gonna re-edit your Book of Shadows to take out the Crowleyisms. She did that, and that is the Gardnerian Book of Shadows that you can buy today on Amazon, and I would imagine Barnes & Noble.
Really? It's so deflates that these things are available.
But you know what, is it fair that it deflates it? I don't think it's totally fair that it deflates it. You know what I mean? I feel the same way because it's not just like a leather-bound book somewhere that you can't
Right.
access. But maybe it was meaningful to enough people that it gradually like rose up the chain.
I guess that's true. There
You know?
used to be like weird occult bookstores. Maybe there still are, whatever.
Yeah.
But like, I feel like the second that somebody in a coven is like, well, how are we going to get this into Borders?
Yeah.
It just makes it less special, you know? I
Yeah.
don't know. It's such a mundane pursuit. Like, we got a listing on Amazon.
Mhm.
How are the reviews for the Necronomicon on
Right.
Amazon?
How they coming?
Is it going well for us? It just, I don't know. It's less fun. It's less creepy.
It makes it feel less special when
Yeah.
something's out in paperback with like a pastel cover,
Right.
as the Gardnerian Book of Shadows is. But even the way it came into publication is a little dramatic, and I'll get there in just a second to do things chronologically. So she edited the work, she took out all the Crowley stuff, she put in some things of her own that were totally new to the Book of Shadows that are apparently pretty central to Wicca now, that people are all about. And people were very into this new Book of Shadows, they're very happy with it. But she ended ended up leaving the coven in 1957. So she came in 53, shook up the Book of Shadows, and then left in 57. She and other members of the coven felt like Gardner was courting too much publicity. He was very into kind of the cachet of being like the boss Wiccan.
Right.
And they were trying to keep this like, a little
Pure.
insular, and this is their religion,
Small.
and what are you doing? You're making this a thing that it's not. And apparently they came to him in the coven and said, you're doing this, we don't like it, it kind of goes against our principles. And he apparently rattled off some Wiccan laws on the spot that justified what he was doing. And a lot of people didn't like that because they said they thought he was just making it up right then.
Yeah,
You know,
that's
it's
like when
like,
a little
well,
kid
no,
is
yeah.
playing, a sport or something, they're like, no, I get 4 strikes, because, I get to go again.
It sounds like exactly that. He's like, no, actually, if you read the text, which I can't show you, but whatever.
Right.
And I will say, like, part of this is me putting my not even interpretation onto it. This is what I read. I'm sure that you could find articles online that are maybe more pro-Gardner, where they're like, well, Valiente was keeping the Wiccan religion from growing. She wanted to keep it small or something.
Right.
I don't know. That could be the case. I use Wikipedia for these things, which are, depending on who is editing it.
Wikipedia.
Wikipedia. There's Wikipedia.
There's definitely
There's definitely
Wikipedia.
Wikipedia. But they're like pretty cut and dry. There wasn't a ton of personality put into these Wikipedia pages, but it seems to me like Valiente was a real deal, like hardcore studying witch and Wiccan.
Okay.
And not to say Gardner wasn't, because it seemed like he did a lot for the movement, and he obviously brought the Book of Shadows into popularity, but it seemed like he maybe got caught up in publicity a little bit. I wonder if he wanted to emulate a little bit of the fame and infamy that Crowley had. I could be totally wrong. I'm basically hedging my bets because I'm saying I know this is some people's religion, and maybe they were like all about Gardner, and I'm sorry to smear his name if that's the case, but take it up with Wikipedia. So she left in 1957 when that happened, and a lot of people went with her, and she kind of started her own coven. But that book remains, they worked on today. It doesn't look like her name is on the front of it or anything, but she obviously gets credit for it in some way. She has some sort of legal dealings with it, because I read a little bit about how it came into publication, and it was just a tiny nugget. I felt like if I got into it further, it could be its own whole thing, but I'm just gonna tell you the one sentence that made me be like, huh, what's going on with this guy Gardner? Wikipedia said that his rival, Charles Cardell, published material from his Book of Shadows. This guy has rivals.
My
That's
rival,
right. People-
Charles Cardell.
People splitting off from covens. I feel like this guy was really shaking up the Wicca world.
He's only not making up with that guy so that he can be like, my rival, Charles Cardell,
Yeah, we
has struck again.
would love to have a rival. We were talking in the beginning with Jennifer about who our nemesis podcast.
Yeah.
We don't have them.
We don't have any enemies.
No, so maybe we haven't truly made it.
Yeah, you're right, yeah. You can't get to a few hundred listens without making an enemy.
That's absolutely right, a couple dozen,
Yeah.
baker's dozen. So his rival published his book. Number one, he has a rival. Number two, bold move on the rival's part. That's a real power stance. To be
Yeah.
like, I'm publishing this and it's mine now. But then later on, Doreen Valiente, who worked on that Book of Shadows, gave permission to another group of people to publish the actual complete work that they did together as that Gardnerian Book of Shadows that you can find. So I guess his rival published pieces of it, and Doreen Valiente gave the okay to do the actual Book of Shadows. So basically, even at its start, even though the Book of Shadows and Grimoires are kind of the same thing, the literal Wiccan Book of Shadows had a collaborative, sort of evolving history right from the beginning. And so it's not super surprising that, as I said in the beginning, people make their own grimoires, make their own books of shadows, and it's very amorphous and just kind of whatever you want it to be, which seems kind of in keeping with the way that they started.
I kind of like that it's a patchwork. I like the
I do
idea
too.
that a bunch of people can claim ownership to a single idea and express themselves in different ways, and it's just as valid as anything else.
Yeah, and
I like
it might just be that calling it a grimoire or calling it a Book of Shadows, if it's not something that's part of your Wiccan religion and is kind of a big part of it. But if you're somebody who just sort of practices a little bit of grab baggy spirituality, if putting your thoughts or intentions or spells or whatever is meaningful to you that has to do with another part of the worldly experience that we can't see, if putting that into something that you call a grimoire or a book of shadows makes it a little bit more solid and impactful to you, then that's totally awesome. I can see why people like spending time decorating a book that kind of keeps their intentions and wishes. That can make it a little bit more of a positive thing and put it a little bit more in the front of your mind. And whatever does that, I think is great. So
Totally.
if it's a grimoire, then that rules.
It's almost like bullet journaling, or
Yes.
just like keeping a diary or not a collage book,
A scrapbook.
scrapbook.
That's definitely part of why I know about it. So I do, I work for a company called Bohoberry that does a lot in the world of bullet journaling. And so I see people referring to their grimoires or their spell books, and it's basically.
Oh, do you really?
Mhm.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
cool.
like not a ton, but it's essentially a bullet journal. They'll have kind of a table of contents in the front where they can flip and find the moon phases for the year, or teas that they feel correspond to certain things that are helpful for them or whatever. And it's just kind of, I definitely see them as sort of modern grimoires or spell books.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And so again, so as far as pop culture goes, the Necronomicon is a famous sort of grimoire, but the term Book of Shadows does pop up in pop culture here and there. There is a so-called Book of Shadows in the show Charmed that was on in the 90s. It was a show about three witches, kind of like a lighthearted, like fun show on the WB. And in that show, their Book of Shadows is inherently physically magical. Like it can defend itself and like propel people from touching it or anything.
Yeah.
In the 90s witch movie The Craft, it is said that a witch keeps her power thoughts in a Book of Shadows.
Power thoughts.
I know, I like that too. That's like a different way to like phrase intentions.
My power thoughts.
Yeah, there's a
I wish
word
I
behind
had
it.
thoughts. My thoughts are not powerful at all. I keep a little notebook, but it just has like stuff I gotta get from the grocery store, things like
Maybe you
that.
should switch it up. Maybe you should get some power thoughts in there and transform that thing into a Book of Shadows.
Yeah, maybe I should.
It's time.
Yeah, there's nothing interesting in here.
Well, that doesn't mean there can't ever be.
No,
Not-
it does. I know myself.
Not unlike, Valiente transforming Gardner's Book of Shadows. Maybe it's time to transform Willie's pocketbook.
Maybe. I've got the fax number for PetSmart.
All right, well, you know what? That could be pretty powerful depending on what you need.
Yeah, it's all about how you use it.
Yeah, exactly. And the last Book of Shadows in pop culture that I will reference, which we kind of have right here as props, is that the second Blair Witch movie was called Blair Witch 2 Book of Shadows, and then
I'm gonna take issue with you.
What?
It's called Book of Shadows, Blair Witch 2, which is way worse.
That is worse, but the book, yeah.
Who puts the subtitle ahead of the title?
Yeah, it is very weird. And then there is no Book of Shadows in that movie.
No.
There's nothing to do with it.
It's one of the most notoriously terrible movies ever made.
Yes, I love it.
Yeah. Cool.
So that's it. Those are grimoires and books of shadows.
Books of Shadows. So go grab a notebook, fill it with your power thoughts.
Yeah, turn it into a book of shadows. It's
Yeah,
not easy.
absolutely. Anybody can do it.
Mm-hmm. Truly they can.
We tried to look up if there were any grimoires available at the library.
I did.
We failed.
I first didn't use kind of like the search engine like to exclude things, and so it first looked like there were, but it was from like a bunch of libraries in New Jersey.
Yeah.
And they weren't serious like grimoires. It was like a comic book called Grimoire and stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's not quite the same.
Yeah.
But yeah, it would have been cool if we could have found. I always wanted to be like some like dusty back corner with
I
all
know.
the big books that nobody sees.
Yeah, exactly.
And hidden there in the stacks is the one evil book, something like that.
I was hoping, but it's probably for the best that there's not. I was hoping for the purpose of the show, but it's probably best for all of us that there isn't one, didn't you, in the Sayreville Public Library?
I don't know, Jennifer just left the room.
I was gonna say she's flying out, maybe she's going
Yeah,
out.
that's true.
Yeah. So, they're not inherently bad, so I shouldn't say it's good that there isn't one.
Maybe
Maybe
she's
maybe
flying out to
a
like choose
wonderful
somebody out.
protective one.
She's
Yeah.
about to choose someone out because there are no grimoires.
Yeah.
What do you mean we don't have any evil books here?
Maybe she put together a grimoire, she put it in a corner of the library for protection,
Oh, I would
and
love
she's
that.
cheesed that it didn't show up on the directory.
I would love that.
Yeah,
Cool, well, there you go.
there you go.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with us. Thank you, everybody, for coming out to our live show here at the Sayreville Public Library. Really appreciate it. We hope you had a good time. For people out there in the world, anybody who's in New Jersey or the tri-state area, Kristen and I are going to be doing a different live show at the end of the month on October 27th at a bar called Pino's in Highland Park, New Jersey. If you look up Guide to the Unknown Live, you can find it out there. If you want to get tickets, come hang out with us. It's going to be fun. Kristen and I are actually, I just got some new equipment. We're going to go to some haunted places in New Jersey, some infamous New Jersey hotspots for paranormal activity. We're going to do some reporting from there, talk about the experience on that show, and hopefully even display some footage about things that we found, or more likely things we did not find.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. Yeah.
But it's going to be a lot of fun, so please go do that. You can also follow at GTTUpod on all social media to stay up to date through the week about spooky things going on in the world. Join our secret Facebook group on facebook.com/groups/GTTUpod.
We also really appreciate if you let us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app you use.
Yep. And if you go to patreon.com/GTTUpod, you can back the show, as so many of you have done, become a Netherworld warrior, and get exclusive material from us, talking about movies, bonus videos of us. A bunch of people have done it. Thank you all so much for your support.
There's an extra episode of Guides to the Unknown that comes out on the 15th of every month, so you'll get that if you donate at that $4 and up tier. And then we've also just been sprinkling extras on top of that here and there. We're only a little bit into October, we already have 2 extra videos up there, so get some bang for your buck.
Absolutely. So thank you all again so much for hanging out with us. We will see you again next week for more spooky stories from the world of the unknown. But until that time comes, we must travel.
Back to the Netherworld go we.
Yay!
Yeah, thank you so
Thank
much
you for
for
coming.
coming out. I hope that you enjoyed that. Yeah, it's a fun little show.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was
Jennifer, how did you find them?
Kristen taught yoga for
Yeah,
a year.
yeah. And
Oh,
Jennifer
wow.
in the studio.
Okay.
Several times.
Yeah.
And I never sleep.
It's
we
my
tried
pleasure.
to do that here today.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad that we weren't successful.
We supposedly had a copy of the Necronomicon, but it's missing.
Oh, really?
Ooh,
Yes.
spooky.
Oh,
Why don't you
this-
donate
Like
yours?
this Necronomicon?
Get it out of
It
your
said
house.
it was by Taylor.
By Taylor. Okay, this is the Simon Necronomicon.
Interesting that there's another Necronomicon with a
There
first
is
name.
a
Yeah.
Spanish translation of that one.
Yes, I know that. Yeah. Yeah, this was like a really popular book. It sold like 1 million copies or something. I guess there was a real boom for it. I don't know.
Oh, somebody's stolen it from the library.
Yes.
They didn't want a record of having taken it out.
Scofflaws.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Who knows?
Want to protect that information so they don't get conjured.
Oh, I think your coat there.
Oh, I have my, yes, I would remember my.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Hope you had a good time.
Yeah. Have a great night.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Take care.
And happy Halloween.
Yeah, happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Yeah.
Finish just night?
Exactly.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I hope you top your best number.
Yes.
Yeah.
Have fun.
145.
Bye.
Bye.
Al, would you stop the?
Yeah.
By anybody who may have been there?
Wait, I want to tell them, Taylor says that Snape wrote a Book of Shadows out of his potion book.
Oh, that's kind of true. Yeah, Snape did kind of turn his potion book by
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, he wrote a new spell. Wrote Sectum Sempra.
Yeah, Sectum Sempra.
Sectum Sempra? Is that what it is?
Yep.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's kind of true.
Yeah, that is true.
I was thinking partway through, I would like to throw a Harry Potter reference in, but
Well, there is one.
there is one.
Yeah.
Thank you, Taylor.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
All right. Good night, guys.
Bye, everybody.
I don't know how to stop this.
Is that an end button?
I'm just going to press the X. Nope, that's not the one.
Quick, Kristen, dance. Hurry!
Dance, Kristen, dance. Wait, hold on.
Slightly. Yeah.